When logic reigns supreme in a world ruled by magic, every choice becomes a calculated risk, and every spell carries the weight of reason. Welcome back to Grimoire Audiobooks, your portal to enchanting stories and daring reimaginings. Today, we delve into Part 7, Chapters 31 to 35 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, the ingenious fanfiction by the brilliant Les Wrong. These chapters push Harry's intellectual journey to new heights as he navigates the intricacies of power, morality, and the ever-blurring lines between reason and belief. Disclaimer: this audiobook is a transformative work based on J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. All original characters, settings, and trademarks belong to their respective owners. This reading is for entertainment purposes only, with no copyright infringement intended. Armed with his sharp mind and scientific reasoning, Harry Potter continues to unravel the mysteries of the wizarding world. As alliances are tested and new challenges emerge, Harry's rationality is put to the ultimate test, with stakes that could redefine his destiny. As the wizarding world eagerly anticipates updates on the Harry Potter TV series, fanfictions like Methods of Rationality remind us of the endless possibilities of imagination. This story stands out for its brilliant infusion of science and philosophy into the magical realm. Les Wrong, an acclaimed thinker and writer, captivates audiences with their masterful exploration of logic, morality, and human nature. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality is a cornerstone of fanfiction, celebrated for its intellectual depth and innovative narrative. So, get comfortable and join us as we embark on Part 7 of this groundbreaking tale. Don't forget, your support is magical. Leave a like and a comment, and the next part will arrive after we hit 12 likes and 12 comments. Let's dive into this extraordinary adventure. 31. Working in groups. Point 2. Harry paced backward and forward in his general's office, which made a wonderful room for pacing. It didn't have any other uses as far as he could tell. How? Hermione shouldn't have won that battle. Not on her first try, not when she wasn't at all violent by her nature. Automatically being a great military commander on top of everything else was too much even for her. Had she read about the tactic in a military history book? But it hadn't been just that one tactic. She'd had her forces perfectly positioned to block any retreat. Her troops had been better coordinated than his or Draco's. Had Professor Quirrell broken his promise not to help her? Had he given her the diary of General Tacticus or something? Harry was missing something here, something really important, and his mind went around and around in circles, and he still couldn't figure it out. Finally, Harry sighed. He wasn't getting anywhere on this, and he had to go learn the breaking drill hex from Hermione or someone before the next battle. Professor Quirrell had explained to Harry, his voice amused but with a sharp undertone of warning, that no magical items except the ones I give you included Muggle technology, no matter how much that wasn't magic. Plus, Harry also needed to figure out how to bring down Mr. Goyle next time. Battles counted for a lot of Quirrell points if you were a general, and Harry needed to get cracking if he wanted to win Professor Quirrell's Christmas wish. In his private room at Slytherin, Draco Malfoy stared off into space, as though the wall in front of his desk was the most fascinating surface in the world. How? In retrospect, it had been an obvious sort of idea as cunning plots went, but Granger wasn't supposed to be cunning. She'd been too much of a Hufflepuff to use a simple strike hex. Had Professor Quirrell been advising her despite his promise? And then Draco finally did what he should have done much earlier. What he should have done after the first time he met with Granger. What Harry Potter had told him to do, trained him to do, and yet Harry had also warned Draco that it would take time to make his brain realize that the methods applied to real life, and Draco hadn't understood that until today. He could have avoided every single one of his mistakes if he'd just applied the things Harry had already told him. Draco said out loud, "I notice that I am confused. Your strength as a rationalist is your ability to be more confused by fiction than by reality." Draco was confused. Therefore, something he believed was fiction. Granger should not have been able to do all that. Therefore, she probably hadn't. I promise not to help General Granger in any way that the two of you don't know about. With sudden, horrified realization, Draco swept papers out of the way, hunting through the mess on his desk until he found it. And there it was, right in the list of people and equipment assigned to each of the 3 armies. Curse Professor Quirrell. Draco had read it, and he still hadn't seen it. The afternoon sunlight poured down into the office of the Sunshine Regiment, illuminating General Granger in her chair as though she glowed with a golden aura. "How long do you think it will take Malfoy to figure it out?" said General Granger. "Not long," said Colonel Blaise Zabini. "He may have already." "How long will it take Potter to figure it out?" "Forever," said General Granger, "unless Malfoy tells him, or one of his own soldiers realizes." "Harry Potter just doesn't think like that." "Really?" said Captain Ernie Macmillan, looking up from one of the corner tables where he was being crushed at chess by Captain Ron Weasley. They'd brought back all the other chairs after Malfoy had left, of course. "I mean, it seems kind of obvious to me. Who would try to come up with all the ideas just by themselves?" "Harry," said Hermione, at exactly the same time Zabini said, "Malfoy." "Malfoy thinks he's way better than everyone else," said Zabini. "And Harry doesn't really see most other people like that," said Hermione. It was kind of sad, actually. Harry had grown up very, very alone. It wasn't that he went around thinking in words that only geniuses had a right to exist. It just wouldn't occur to him that anyone in Hermione's army besides Hermione could have any good ideas. Anyhow, Hermione said, "Captains Goldstein and Weasley, you're on duty for thinking up strategic ideas for our next battle. Captains Macmillan and Macmillan and Bones, try to come up with some tactics we can use, also any training you think we should try. Oh, and congratulations on your marching song, Captain Goldstein. I think it was a big plus for Esprit de Corps." "What are you doing?" said Susan. "And Colonel Zabini?" Hermione stood up out of her chair, stretching. "I'll try to figure out what Harry Potter is thinking, and Colonel Zabini will try to figure out what Draco Malfoy might do, and both of us will join you again after we come up with something. I'm going to walk while I think. Zabini, you want to come along?" "Yes, General," said Zabini stiffly. It hadn't been meant as an order. Hermione sighed to herself a little. This was going to take some getting used to, and although Zabini's first idea had certainly worked, she wasn't quite sure that Professor Quirrell's, quote, mixture of positive and negative incentives, unquote, would be enough to keep the Slytherin fully on her side until December, when traitors would be allowed for the first time. She still had no idea what she was going to do with Professor Quirrell's Christmas wish, either. Maybe she'd just ask Mandy if she wanted anything when the time came around. 32. Interlude. Personal financial management. "But Headmaster," Harry argued, some of his desperation leaking into his voice, "leaving all of my assets in one undiversified vault full of gold coins. It's crazy, Headmaster. It's like, I don't know, doing transfiguration experiments without consulting a recognized authority. You just don't do that with money." From the lined face of the old wizard, underneath a festive holiday, how like a catastrophic automobile collision between cars of green and red cloth, a grave, sad look peered out at Harry. "I'm sorry, Harry," said Dumbledore, "and I do apologize, but allowing you control over your own finances would give you far too much independence of action." Harry's mouth opened and no sound came out. He was literally speechless. "I will permit you to withdraw 5 galleons for Christmas presents," said Dumbledore, "which is more than any boy your age should spend, but poses no threat, I think, dash." "I can't believe you just said that." The words burst out of Harry's mouth. "You admit to being that manipulative?" "Manipulative," said the old wizard, smiling slightly. "No, manipulative would be if I did not admit it, or if I had some deeper motive behind the obvious." This is quite straightforward, Harry. You are not yet ready to play the game, and it would be foolish to allow you thousands of galleons with which to upset the game board. The bright hustle and bustle of Diagon Alley had increased by 100-fold and redoubled as Christmas approached, with all the shops enshrouded in brilliant sorceries that flashed and sparkled as though the season spirit was about to blaze out of control and turn the whole area into a cheerful holiday crater. The streets were so crowded with witches and wizards in festive and loud clothing that your eyes were assaulted almost as severely as your ears. And it was clear, from the bewildering variety of the shoppers, that Diagon Alley was considered an international attraction. There were witches wrapped in giant swathes of cloth like toweled mummies, and wizards in formal top hats and bathrobes, and young children barely past toddling age who were decorated with lights that blazed almost as bright as the shops themselves, as their parents took them hand in hand through that magic wonderland and let them shriek to their heart's content. It was the season to be merry, and in the midst of all that light and cheer, a note of blackest night, a cold, dark atmosphere that cleared a few precious paces of distance even in the midst of all that crush. "No," said Professor Quirrell, with a look of grim revulsion, like he'd just bitten into food that not only tasted horrible, but was morally repugnant to boot. It was the sort of grim face an ordinary person might make after biting into a meat pie and discovering that it was rotten and had been made from kittens. "Oh, come on," Harry said. "You must have some ideas." "Mr. Potter," Professor Quirrell said, his lips set in a thin line, "I agreed to act as your adult guardian on this expedition. I did not agree to advise you on your choice of presents. I don't do Christmas, Mr. Potter. How about Newton Moss?" Harry said brightly. Isaac Newton actually was born on December 25th, unlike some other historical figures I could name. This failed to impress Professor Quirrell. "Look," said Harry, "I'm sorry, but I've got to do something special for Fred and George, and I've got no idea of my options." Professor Quirrell made a thoughtful humming sound. "You could ask which family members they most dislike, and then hire an assassin. I know someone from a certain government in exile who is quite competent, and he would give you a discount on multiple Weasleys." "This Christmas," Harry said, dropping his voice into a lower register, "give your friends the gift of death." That made Professor Quirrell smile. It went all the way to his eyes. "Well," said Harry, "at least you didn't suggest getting them a pet rat dash." Harry's mouth snapped shut, and he was regretting the words almost as soon as they were out of his mouth. "Pardon me," said Professor Quirrell. "Nothing," Harry said at once. Long dumb story. And telling it seemed wrong somehow. Maybe because Harry was afraid Professor Quirrell would have laughed even if Bill Weasley hadn't been cured and everything put back to right. And where had Professor Quirrell been that he'd never heard the story? Harry had gotten the impression that everyone in magical Britain knew. "Look," said Harry, "I'm trying to solidify their loyalty to me, you know? Make the Weasley twins my minions? Like the old saying goes, a friend isn't someone you use once and then throw away. A friend is someone you use over and over again. Fred and George are two of the most useful friends I have in Hogwarts, Professor Quirrell, and I plan to use them over and over again. So, if you'd help me be Slytherin here and suggest something they might be very grateful for." Harry's voice trailed off invitingly. "You just had to pitch these things the right way." They walked on for a good way before Professor Quirrell spoke again, his voice practically dripping with distaste. "The Weasley twins are using second-hand wands, Mr. Potter. They would be reminded of your generosity with every charm they cast." Harry clapped his hands together in involuntary excitement. "Just put the money on account at Ollivander's and tell Mr. Ollivander to never refund it. No, better yet, to send it to Lucius Malfoy if the Weasley twins didn't show up before the start of their next school year." "That's brilliant, Professor." Professor Quirrell did not look like he appreciated the compliment. I suppose I can tolerate Christmas in that spirit, Mr. Potter, though only barely. Then he smiled slightly. Of course that will cost you 14 galleons, and you only have 5. 5 galleons, Harry said, with a sniff of outrage. Just who does the headmaster think he's dealing with, anyway? I think, said Professor Quirrell, that it simply did not occur to him to fear the consequences if you turned your ingenuity to the task of obtaining funds. Though you were wise to lose, rather than making it an explicit threat. Out of curiosity, Mr. Potter, what would you have done if I hadn't turned away in boredom while you, in a fit of childish pique, counted out 5 galleons worth of nuts? Well, the easiest way would have been to borrow money from Draco Malfoy, said Harry. Professor Quirrell chuckled briefly. Seriously, Mr. Potter. Duly noted. Probably I'd have done a few celebrity appearances. I wouldn't resort to anything economically disruptive just for spending money. Harry had checked, and he would be allowed to keep the time turner while he went home for the holidays, so that his sleep cycle didn't start to rotate. But then it was also possible that someone kept an eye out for magical day traders. The gold and silver trick would have taken work on the Muggle end and seed funding, and the goblins might have gotten suspicious after the first cycle. And starting a real bank would be a lot of work. Harry hadn't quite worked out any money-making methods that were fast and certain and safe, so he'd been very glad when Professor Quirrell had turned out to be so easily fooled. I do hope those 5 galleons will be enough to last, since you counted them so carefully, said Professor Quirrell. I doubt the headmaster shall be so eager to entrust me with your vault key a second time, once he discovers I've been tricked. I'm sure you did your best, Harry said with deep gratitude. Do you need any assistance finding a safe place to store all those nuts, Mr. Potter? Well, sort of, said Harry. Do you know of any good investment opportunities, Professor Quirrell? And the two of them walked on, in their tiny sphere of silence and isolation, through the brilliant and bustling crowds, and if you looked carefully, you would see that where they went, leafy boughs faded and flowers withered, and children's toys that played cheerful bells changed to lower and more ominous notes. Harry did notice, but he didn't say anything, just smiled a little to himself. Everyone had their own way of celebrating the holidays, and the Grinch was as much a part of Christmas as Santa. 33. Coordination problems. Point 1. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. Albus, Minerva said, not even trying to keep the worry out of her voice as the two of them entered the Great Hall. Something has to be done. The atmosphere at Hogwarts before Yuletide was usually bright and cheerful. The Great Hall had already been decorated in green and red, after a Slytherin and a Gryffindor whose Yule wedding had become a symbol of friendship transcending houses and allegiances, a tradition almost as ancient as Hogwarts itself, and which had even spread to Muggle countries. Now the students eating dinner were glancing nervously over their shoulders, or sending vicious glares at other tables, or at some tables arguing heatedly. You could have described the atmosphere as tense, perhaps, but the phrase coming to Minerva's mind was 5th degree of caution. Take a school into 4 houses divided. Now into each year, add 3 armies at war. And the partisanship of Dragon and Sunshine and Chaos had spread beyond the first years. They had become the armies for those who had no armies. Students were wearing armbands, with insignia of fire or smile or upraised hand, and hexing each other in the corridors. All 3 first-year generals had told them to stop. Even Draco Malfoy had heard her out and then nodded grimly, but their supposed followers hadn't listened. Dumbledore gazed out at the tables with a distant look. In every city, the old wizard quoted softly, the population has been divided for a long time past into the blue and the green factions. And they fight against their opponents, knowing not for what end they imperil themselves. So there grows up in them against their fellow men a hostility which has no cause, and at no time does it cease or disappear, for it gives place neither to the ties of marriage, nor of relationship, nor of friendship. And the case is the same even though those who differ with respect to these colors be brothers or any other kin. I, for my part, am unable to call this anything except a disease of the soul. I'm sorry, said Minerva. I don't dash. Procopius, said Dumbledore. They took their chariot racing very seriously in the Roman Empire. Yes, Minerva, I agree that something must be done soon, Minerva said, her voice lowering even further. Albus, I think it must be done before Saturday. On Sunday, most students would leave Hogwarts to stay the holiday with their families. Saturday, then, was the final battle of the 3 first-year armies that would determine the awarding of Professor Quirrell's thrice-cursed Christmas wish. Dumbledore glanced over at her, studying her gravely. You fear that the explosion will come then, and someone will be hurt. Minerva nodded. And that Professor Quirrell will be blamed. Minerva nodded again, her face tight. She had long since become wise in the ways that defense professors were fired. Albus, Minerva said, we cannot lose Professor Quirrell now, we cannot. If he but stays through January, our 5th years will pass their OWLs. If he stays through March, our 7th years will pass their newts. He is remedying years of neglect in months. A whole generation will grow up able to defend themselves in spite of the Dark Lord's curse. You must stop the battle, Albus. Band the armies now. I am not sure the defense professor would take that kindly, said Dumbledore, glancing over toward the head table where Quirrell was drooling into his soup. He did seem most attached to his armies, though when I agreed I thought there would be 4 in each year. The old wizard sighed. A clever man, probably with the best of intentions, but perhaps not clever enough, I fear. And to ban the armies might also trigger the explosion. But then, Albus, what will you do? The old wizard favored her with a benign smile. Why, I shall plot, of course. It's the new fashion in Hogwarts. And they had come too close to the head table for Minerva to say anything more. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. The first battle in December had been messy, or so Draco had heard. The second battle had been deranged. And the next one would be worse, unless the 3 of them together succeeded in their last desperate attempt to stop it. Professor Quirrell, this is insanity, Draco said flatly. This isn't Slytherin anymore, it's just... Draco was at a loss for words. He waved his hands helplessly. You can't possibly do any real plots with all this stuff going on. Last battle, one of my soldiers faked his own suicide. We have Hufflepuffs trying to plot, and they think they can, but they can't. Things just happen at random now. It doesn't have anything to do with who's cleverest or which army fights best. He couldn't even describe it. I agree with Mr. Malfoy, said Granger in the tones of someone who hadn't ever expected to hear herself saying those words. Allowing traitors isn't working, Professor Quirrell. Draco had tried forbidding anyone in his army to plot except him, and that had just driven the plots underground. No one wanted to be left out when the soldiers and other armies got to plot. After miserably losing their last battle, he'd finally given in and revoked his decree, but by then his soldiers had already started setting their own personal plans in motion, without any sort of central coordination. After being told all the plans, or what his soldiers claimed were their plans, Draco had tried to sketch a plot to win the final battle. It had required considerably more than 3 different things to go right, and Draco had used Incendio on the paper and Everto to vanish the ashes, because if Father had seen it, he would have been disowned. Professor Quirrell's eyelids were half closed, his chin resting on his hands as he leaned forward onto his desk. And you, Mr. Potter, said the defense professor. Are you likewise in agreement? All we need to do is shoot Franz Ferdinand, and we could start World War I, said Harry. It's gone to complete chaos. I'm all for it. Harry, said Draco in utter shock. He didn't even realize until a second later that he'd said it at exactly the same time and in exactly the same tone of indignation as Granger. Granger shot him a startled glance, and Draco carefully kept his face neutral. "Oops. That's right," said Harry. "I'm betraying you. Both of you. Again. Ha ha." Professor Quirrell was smiling thinly, though his eyes were still half-closed. "And why is that, Mr. Potter?" "Because I think I can cope with the chaos better than Miss Granger or Mr. Malfoy," said the traitor. "Our war is a zero-sum game, and it doesn't matter whether it's easy or hard in an absolute sense, only who does better or worse." Harry Potter was learning far too fast. Professor Quirrell's eyes moved beneath their lids to regard Draco, and then Granger. "In truth, Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, I simply could not live with myself if I shut down the grand debacle before its climax. One of your soldiers has even become a quadruple agent." "Quadruple," said Granger. "But there's only 3 sides in the war." "Yes," said Professor Quirrell. "You'd think that, wouldn't you? I am not sure that there has ever in history been a quadruple agent, or any army with such a high fraction of real and pretended traitors. We are exploring new realms, Miss Granger, and we cannot turn back now." Draco left the defense professor's office with his teeth gritting hard against each other, and Granger looking even more annoyed beside him. "I can't believe you did that, Harry," said Granger. "Sorry," Harry said, not sounding sorry at all, his lips curved up in a merry smile of evil. "Remember, Hermione, it is just a game, and why should generals like us be the only ones who get to plot? And besides, what are the 2 of you going to do about it? Team up against me?" Draco traded glances with Granger, knowing that his own face was as tight as hers. Harry had been relying more and more openly and gloatingly on Draco's refusal to make common cause with a mudblood girl, and Draco was beginning to get sick of having that used against him. If this kept up much longer, he was going to ally with Granger just to crush Harry Potter and see how much the son of a mudblood liked that. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. Hermione stared at the parchment Zabini had given her, feeling utterly and completely helpless. There were names and lines connecting the names to other names, and some of the lines were in different colors and— "Tell me," said General Granger, "is there anyone in my army who isn't a spy?" The 2 of them weren't in the office, but in another, deserted classroom, and they were alone, because Colonel Zabini had said it was now nearly certain that at least one of the captains was a traitor. Probably Captain Goldstein, but Zabini didn't know for sure. Her question had put an ironic smile on the young Slytherin's face. Blaise Zabini always seemed a little disdainful of her, but he didn't seem to actively dislike her. Nothing like the derision he held for Draco Malfoy or the resentment he had developed for Harry Potter. She had worried at first about Zabini betraying her, but the boy seemed desperate to show that the other 2 generals were no better than him, and Hermione thought that while Zabini would probably be happy to sell her out to anyone else, he'd never let Malfoy or Harry win. "Most of your soldiers are still loyal to you, I'm pretty sure," said Zabini. "It's just that no one wants to be left out of the fun." The scornful look on the Slytherin's face made it clear what he thought of people who didn't take plotting seriously. "So they think they can be double agents and secretly work for our side while pretending to betray us. And that would also go for anyone in the other armies who says they want to be our spy," Hermione said carefully. The young Slytherin shrugged. "I think I did a good job of telling which ones really want to sell out Malfoy. I'm not sure anyone really wants to sell out Potter to you. But not as a sure bet for betraying Potter to Malfoy, and since I had Entwistle approach him supposedly on behalf of Malfoy, and Entwistle really reports to us, that's almost as good dash." Hermione closed her eyes for a moment. "We're going to lose, aren't we?" "Look," Zabini said patiently, "you're in the lead right now on Quirrell points. We just have to not lose this last battle completely, and you'll have enough Quirrell points to win the Christmas wish. Professor Quirrell had announced that the final battle would operate on a formal scoring system, which he'd been asked to do to avoid recriminations afterward. Each time you shot someone, the general of your army got 2 Quirrell points. A gong would ring through the battle area. They didn't know yet where they would be fighting, though Hermione was hoping for the forest again, where Sunshine did well, and its pitch would tell which army had won the points. And if anyone was faking being hit, the gong would ring out anyway, and then a double gong would ring later, after no fixed time, to hail the retraction. And if you called the name of an army, cried for Sunshine, or for Chaos, or for Dragon, it switched your allegiance to that army. Even Hermione had been able to see the flaw in that set of rules. But Professor Quirrell had gone on to announce that if you'd been originally assigned to Sunshine, nobody could shoot you in the name of Sunshine, or rather, they could, but then Sunshine lost a single Quirrell point, symbolized by a triple gong. That prevented you from shooting your own soldiers for points, and discouraged suiciding before the enemy got you, but you could still shoot spies if you had to. Right now, Hermione had 244 Quirrell points, and Malfoy had 219, and Harry had 221, and there were 24 soldiers in each army. So we fight carefully, Hermione said, and just try not to lose too badly. No, said Zabini. The young Slytherin's face was now serious. The problem is, Malfoy and Potter both know that their only way to win is to combine and crush us, then fight it out on their own. So here's what I think we should do, Dash. Hermione left the classroom in something of a daze. Zabini's plan hadn't been the obvious one. It had been strange and complicated and layered, and the sort of thing she would have expected Harry to come up with, not Zabini. It felt wrong just for her to be able to understand a plan like that. Young girls shouldn't be able to understand plans like that. The hat would have sorted her into Slytherin if it had seen that she could understand plans like that. The awesome thing was how fast he'd been able to escalate the chaos once he started doing it deliberately. Harry sat in his office. He'd been given the authority to order furniture from the house elves, so he'd ordered a throne and curtains in a black and crimson pattern. Scarlet light like blood, mixed with shadow, poured over the floor. Something in Harry felt like he'd finally come home. Before him stood the 4 lieutenants of chaos, his most trusted minions, one of whom was a traitor. This was what life should be like. "We are gathered," said Harry. "Let chaos reign," chorused his 4 lieutenants. "My hovercraft is full of eels," said Harry. "I will not buy this record. It is scratched," chorused his 4 lieutenants. All Mimsy were the Borogroves, and the Moam Rath's outgrabe. That concluded the formalities. "How goes the confusion?" Harry said in a dry whisper, like Emperor Palpatine. "It goes well, General Chaos," said Neville in the tone he always used for military matters, a tone so deep that the boy often had to stop and cough. The chaotic lieutenant was neatly dressed in his black school robes, trimmed in the yellow of Hufflepuff House, and his hair was parted and combed in the usual look for an earnest young boy. Harry had liked the incongruity better than any of the cloaks they'd tried. "Our Legionnaires have begun 5 new plots since yesterday evening." Harry smiled evilly. "Do any of them have a chance of working?" "I don't think so," said Neville of Chaos. "Here's the report." "Excellent," said Harry, and laughed chillingly as he took the parchment from Neville's hand, trying his best to make it sound like he was choking on dust. That brought the total to 60. "Let Draco try to handle that." "Let him try." And as for Blaise Zabini, Harry laughed again, and this time it didn't even take an effort to sound evil. He really needed to borrow someone's pet Kneazle for his staff meetings, so he'd have a cat to stroke while he did this. "Can the Legion stop making plots now?" said Finnegan of Chaos. "I mean, don't we have enough already, Dash?" "No," Harry said flatly. "We can never have enough plots." Professor Quirrell had put it perfectly. They were pushing the boundaries further, perhaps, than they had ever been pushed, and Harry wouldn't have been able to live with himself if he'd turned back now. There came a knock at the door. "That will be the Dragon General," Harry said, smiling with evil prescience. "He arrives precisely as I expected. Do show him in and yourselves out." And the 4 lieutenants of chaos shuffled out, casting dark looks at Draco as the enemy general entered into Harry's secret lair. If he wasn't allowed to do this when he was older, Harry was just going to stay 11 forever. The sun was dripping through the red curtains, sending rays of blood dancing across the floor from behind Harry Potter's grown-up-sized cushioned chair, which he had covered in gold and silver glitter and insisted on referring to as his throne. Draco was beginning to feel a lot more confident that he'd done the right thing in deciding to overthrow Harry Potter before he could take over the world. Draco couldn't even imagine what it would be like to live under his rule. "Good evening, Dragon General," said Harry Potter in a chill whisper. "You have arrived just as I expected." This was not surprising, considering that Draco and Harry had agreed on the meeting time in advance. And it also was an evening, but by now Draco knew better than to say anything. "General Potter," Draco said with as much dignity as he could manage, "you know that our 2 armies have to work together for either of us to win Professor Quirrell's wish, right?" "Yes," hissed Harry, like the boy thought he was a parcel mouth. "We must cooperate to destroy Sunshine, and only then fight it out between us. But if one of us betrays the other earlier on, that one could gain an advantage in the later fight. And the Sunshine General, who knows all this, will try to trick each of us into thinking the other has betrayed them. And you and I, who know that, will be tempted to betray the other and pretend that it is Granger's trickery. And Granger knows that as well." Draco nodded. That much was obvious. "And both of us only want to win, and there's no one else who'll punish either of us if we defect." "Precisely," said Harry Potter, his face now turning serious. "We are faced with a true prisoner's dilemma." The prisoner's dilemma, according to Harry's teachings, ran thus. 2 prisoners had been locked in separate cells. There was evidence against each prisoner, but only minor evidence, enough for a prison sentence of 2 years apiece. Each prisoner could opt to defect, betray the other, testify against them in court, and this would take 1 year off their own prison sentence, but add 2 years to the others. Or a prisoner could cooperate, staying silent. So if both prisoners defected, each testifying against the other, they would serve 3 years apiece. If both cooperated or stayed silent, they would serve 2 years each. But if one defected and the other cooperated, the defector would serve a single year, and the cooperator would serve 4. And both prisoners had to make their decision without knowing the other one's choice, and neither would be given a chance to change their decision afterward. Draco had observed that if the 2 prisoners had been Death Eaters during the Wizarding War, the Dark Lord would have killed any traitors. Harry had nodded and said that was one way to resolve the prisoner's dilemma, and in fact both Death Eaters would want there to be a Dark Lord for exactly that reason. Draco had asked Harry to stop and let him to think about this for a while before they continued. It had explained a lot about why Father and his friends had agreed to serve under a Dark Lord, who often wasn't nice to them. In fact, Harry had said, this was pretty much the reason why people had governments. You might be better off if you stole from someone else, just like each prisoner would be individually better off if they defected in the prisoner's dilemma. But if everyone thought like that, the country would fall into chaos and everyone would be worse off, like what would happen if both prisoners defected. So people let themselves be ruled by governments, just like the Death Eaters had let themselves be ruled by the Dark Lord. Draco had asked Harry to stop again. Draco had always taken for granted that ambitious wizards put themselves in power because they wanted to rule, and people let themselves be ruled because they were scared little Hufflepuffs. And this, on reflection, still seemed true, but Harry's perspective was fascinating even if it was wrong. But Harry had continued afterward. The fear of a third party punishing you is not the only possible reason to cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma. Suppose, Harry had said, you were playing the game against a magically produced identical copy of yourself. Draco had said that if there were two Dracos, of course neither Draco would want anything bad to happen to the other one, not to mention that no Malfoy would let himself become known as a traitor. Harry had nodded again, and said that this was yet another solution to the prisoner's dilemma. People might cooperate because they cared about each other, or because they had senses of honor, or because they wanted to preserve their reputation. Indeed, Harry had said, it was rather difficult to construct a true prisoner's dilemma. In real life, people usually cared about the other person, or their honor or their reputation, or a Dark Lord's punishment, or something besides the prison sentences. But suppose the copy had been of someone completely selfish. Pansy Parkinson had been the example they'd used. So each pansy only cared what happened to her, and not to the other pansy. Given that this was all Pansy cared about, and that there was no Dark Lord, and Pansy wasn't worried about her reputation, and Pansy either had no sense of honor or didn't consider herself obligated to the other prisoner, then would the rational thing be for Pansy to cooperate, or defect? Some people, Harry said, claimed that the rational thing to do was for Pansy to defect against her copy, but Harry, plus someone named Douglas Hofstadter, thought these people were wrong. Because Harry had said if Pansy defected, not at random, but for what seemed to her like rational reasons, then the other Pansy would think exactly the same way. Two identical copies wouldn't decide different things. So Pansy had to choose between a world in which both Pansies cooperated, or a world in which both Pansies defected, and she was better off if both copies cooperated. And if Harry had thought rational people did defect in the prisoner's dilemma, then he wouldn't have done anything to spread that kind of rationality, because a country or a conspiracy full of rational people would dissolve into chaos. You would tell your enemies about rationality, which had all sounded reasonable at the time, but now the thought was occurring to Draco that, Draco said, that the rational solution to the prisoner's dilemma is to cooperate. But of course you would want me to believe that, wouldn't you? And if Draco was fooled into cooperating, Harry would just say, haha, betrayed you again, and laugh at him about it afterward. I wouldn't fake your lessons, Harry said seriously. But I have to remind you, Draco, that I didn't say you should just automatically cooperate. Not on a true prisoner's dilemma like this one. What I said was that when you choose, you shouldn't think like you're choosing for just yourself, or like you're choosing for everyone. You should think like you're choosing for all the people who are similar enough to you that they'll probably do the same thing you do for the same reasons. And also choosing the predictions made by anyone who knows you well enough to predict you accurately, so that you never have to regret being rational because of the correct predictions that other people make about you. Remind me to explain about Newcomb's problem at some point. So the question you and I have to ask, Draco, is this: are we similar enough that we'll probably do the same thing whatever it is, making our decisions in mostly the same way? Or do we know each other well enough to predict each other, so that I can predict whether you'll cooperate or defect, and you can predict that I've decided to do the same thing I predict you'll do, because I know that you can predict me deciding that? And Draco could not help but think that since he had to strain just to understand half of that, the answer was obviously no. Yes, said Draco. There was a pause. I see, said Harry, sounding disappointed.
Oh, well.
I guess we'll have to think of some other way, then. Draco hadn't thought that was going to work. Draco and Harry talked about it back and forth. They had both agreed much earlier that what they did on the battlefield would not count as broken promises in real life, though Draco was a little angry about what Harry had done in Professor Quirrell's office, and said so. But if the two of them couldn't rely on honor or friendship, that did leave the question of how to get their armies to work together on beating Sunshine, despite everything Granger might try to break them up. Professor Quirrell's rules didn't make it tempting to let Sunshine kill the other army soldiers. That just increased the bar you had to pass yourself. But it did tempt each side to steal kills instead of acting like a single army would, or to shoot some of the other side's soldiers during the confusion of battle. Hermione was walking back to Ravenclaw, not really looking where she was going, her mind preoccupied with war and treachery and other age-inappropriate concepts, and she turned a corner and bumped straight into a grown-up. "Sorry," she said automatically, and then, entirely without thinking, "Eeks." "Don't worry, Miss Granger," said the cheerful smile, set beneath the twinkling eyes and above the silver beard of the headmaster of Hogwarts. "You are quite forgiven." Her gaze was helplessly locked on the kindly face of the most powerful wizard in the world, who was also the chief warlock, who was also the supreme mugwump, who had gone insane years ago from the stress of fighting the Dark Lord, and numerous other facts that were popping up into her mind one after the other, while her throat went on making little embarrassing squeaks. "In fact, Miss Granger," said Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, "it is quite lucky that we bumped into each other." "Why, I was just now wondering curiously what the three of you were thinking of asking for your wishes." Saturday dawned bright and clear, and with the students speaking in hushed voices, as though the first to shout might set off the explosion. Draco had hoped that they would be fighting in the upper levels of Hogwarts again. Professor Quirrell had said that real fights were more likely to take place in cities than forests, and fighting inside schoolrooms and corridors was supposed to simulate that, with ribbons to mark the allowed areas. Dragon Army had done well in those fights. Instead, just as Draco had feared, Professor Quirrell had come up with something special for this battle. The battleground was the Hogwarts Lake. And not in boats, either. They were fighting underwater. The giant squid had been temporarily paralyzed. Spells had been set in place to keep away the Grindylows. Professor Quirrell had gone and talked to the merfolk, and all the soldiers had been issued potions of underwater action that allowed them to breathe, see clearly, talk to each other, and swim not quite as fast as a fast walk by kicking their legs. A huge silver sphere hung in the center of the battleground, shining like a small underwater moon. It would help to provide a sense of direction at first. The moon would slowly go into eclipse as the battle went on, and when it had gone entirely dark, the battle would end if it hadn't already. War in water. You couldn't defend a perimeter. Attackers could come at you from any direction, and even with the potion, you couldn't see very far in the darkness of the lake. And if you swam too far away from the action, you would start to glow after a while and be easy to hunt down. Ordinarily, if an army scattered and ran instead of fighting, Professor Quirrell would just declare them defeated, but today they were working on a point system. Of course, you still had some time before you started to glow, if you wanted to play assassin. Dragon Army had been set low in the water at the start of the game. Above and far away, the distant underwater moon shone. The murky water was mostly lit by Lumos charms, though his soldiers would extinguish the lights as soon as they began maneuvers. There was no point in letting the enemy see you before you saw them. Draco kicked his legs a few times, propelling him to a higher position from which he could gaze down at where his soldiers hovered in the water. The conversations died down almost at once under Draco's icy glare, his soldiers looking up at him with gratifying expressions of fear and worry. "Listen to me very carefully," said General Malfoy. His voice came out a little lower, a little burbly with bubbles. "Listen to me very carefully," but the sound traveled clearly. "There's only one way we can win this. We got to march on Sunshine together with Chaos and beat Sunshine. Then we fight it out with Potter and win. That's got to happen, understand? No matter what else goes on, that part has to happen that way, Dash." And Draco explained the plan he and Harry had come up with. Astonished looks were exchanged among the soldiers. "And if any of your plots get in the way of that," finished Draco, "after we are out of the water, I will set you on fire." There was a nervous chorus of yesers. "And everyone with secret orders, make sure you carry them out to the letter," said Draco. Around half his soldiers openly nodded, and Draco marked them for death after he rose to power. Of course, all the private orders were fake, like one dragon being told to offer a false trader's commission to another dragon, and the second dragon being told in hushed confidence to report anything said by the first dragon. Draco had told each dragon that the whole war could depend on that one thing, and that he hoped they understood it was more important than the plans they'd previously made. With luck that would keep all the idiots happy, and maybe flush out a few spies to boot if the reports didn't match the instructions. Draco's real plan for winning against chaos. Well, it was simpler than the one he'd burned, but Father still wouldn't have liked it. Despite trying, though, Draco hadn't been able to think of anything better. It was a plot that couldn't possibly have worked against anyone except Harry Potter. In fact, it had been Harry's plan originally, according to the traitor, though Draco had guessed that without being told. Draco and the traitor had just modified it a little. Harry took a deep breath, feeling the water gurgle harmlessly in his lungs. They'd fought in the forest, and he hadn't gotten a chance to say it. They'd fought in the corridors of Hogwarts, and he hadn't gotten a chance to say it. They'd fought in the air, broomsticks issued to every soldier, and it still hadn't made sense to say it. Harry had thought he wouldn't ever get to say those words, not while he was still young enough for them to be real. The Chaos Legionnaires were looking at Harry in puzzlement, as their general swam with his feet pointing up toward the distant light of the surface, and his head pointed down toward the murky depths. "Why are you upside down?" the young commander shouted at his army, and began to explain how to fight after you abandon the privileged orientation of gravity. A hollow, booming bell echoed through the water, and on the instant, Zabini and Anthony and 5 other soldiers struck out downward into the murky depths of the lake. Parvati Patil, the only Gryffindor in the group, turned her head back for a moment and gave them all a cheery wave as she dived, and after a moment, Scott and Matt did the same. The rest just sank and vanished. General Granger swallowed a lump in her throat as she watched them go. She was risking everything on this, dividing her army instead of just trying to take as many enemy soldiers with them as possible. The thing to realize, Zabini had told her, was that no army would move until they had a plan that let them expect victory. Sunshine couldn't just plan to win themselves, they had to make both other armies think they would win until it was too late. Ernie and Ron still looked like they were in shock. Susan was gazing after the disappearing soldiers with a calculating look. Her army, what was left of it, just looked bewildered, traceries of light dappling on their uniforms as they all drifted just below the sunlit surface of the lake. "Now what?" said Ron. "Now we wait," said Hermione, loudly enough for all the soldiers to hear. It felt odd to talk with her mouth full of water. She kept feeling like she was committing some sort of horrible impoliteness at the dinner table and was about to drool all over herself. All of us left here going to get zapped, but that was going to happen anyway with Dragon and Chaos ganging up on us. We've just got to take as many of them with us as we can. "I've got a plan," said one of her Sunshine soldiers. Hannah, her voice had been a little hard to recognize at first. "It's like all complicated, but I know how we can get Dragon and Chaos to start fighting each other, Dash." "Me too," said Faye. "I've got a plan too. See, Neville Longbottom is secretly on our side, Dash." "You were talking to Neville," said Ernie. "That's not right. I was the one who Dash." Daphne Greengrass and a couple of other Slytherins who hadn't gone with Zabini were giggling helplessly as the cries of "No, wait, I was the one who got Longbottom" erupted from one soldier after another. Hermione just looked at them all wearily. "Okay," said Hermione when it had all died down. "Does everyone get it? All your plots were faked by the Chaos Legion, or maybe some by Dragon. Anyone who really wanted to betray Harry or Malfoy went straight to me, or Zabini, not you. Just go ahead and compare notes on all your secret plots and you'll see it for yourselves. She might not be as good at plotting as Zabini, but she could always understand what all her officers told her. That was why Professor Quirrell had made her the general. So don't bother trying to do any plots when the other armies get here. Just fight, okay? Please? But, said Ernie with shock on his face, Neville is in Hufflepuff. You're saying he lied to us? Daphne was laughing so hard and so helplessly that the exhalations had turned her upside down in the water. I'm not sure what Longbottom is, said Ron darkly, but I don't think he's a Hufflepuff anymore. Not now that Harry Potter's got to him. Do you know, said Susan, I asked him that and Neville told me he had become a Chaos Hufflepuff. Anyway, said Hermione in a loud voice, Zabini took with everyone who we thought was a spy, so in our army we can stop watching each other quite so hard now, I hope. Anthony was a spy, yelled Ron. Parvati was a spy, gasped Hannah. Parvati was totally a spy, said Daphne. She shopped at the spy shoe store and wore spy lipstick, and someday she's going to marry a nice spy husband and have a lot of little spies. And then a gong sound echoed through the water, indicating that Sunshine had just scored 2 points. This was shortly followed by the triple gong of Dragon losing a single point. Traitors weren't allowed to kill generals, not after the disaster of the first battle in December when all 3 generals had been shot in the first minute. But with any luck, said Hermione. It sounds like Mr. Crabbe is taking a little nap. Like 2 shoals of fish, the army swam along. Neville Longbottom kicked his feet in slow, measured motions. Diving, always diving in whatever direction you happen to be moving. You wanted to show the enemy the smallest profile, present them with your head or your feet. So you were always diving, downward and head first, and the enemy was always down. Like every Chaos Legionnaire in the army, Neville's head was constantly rotating as he swam, looking up, down, around, to every side. Not just watching for Sunshine soldiers, but watching for any sign that a Chaos Legionnaire had drawn their wand and was about to betray them. Usually traitors waited until the confusion of battle to make their move, but that early gong had put them all on guard. The truth was Neville was feeling sad about that. In November, he'd been a soldier in a united army, all of them pulling together and helping each other, and now they were all watching each other constantly for the first signs of betrayal. It might have been more fun for General Chaos, but it wasn't nearly as much fun for Neville. The direction formerly known as up was getting steadily brighter as they came closer to the surface and Sunshine. Wands out, said General Chaos. Neville's squad drew their wands, pointing them straight ahead toward the enemy, as their heads scanned around more rapidly. If there were sunny traitors, the time was approaching for them to strike. The other shoal of fish dragon army was doing the same thing. Now, shouted the distant voice of the dragon general. Now, shouted General Chaos. For Sunshine, shouted all the soldiers in both armies, and charged downward. What? Said Minerva involuntarily as she watched the screens from next to the lake. A cry echoed in many other places. All of Hogwarts was watching this battle as they had watched the first. Professor Quirrell was laughing dryly. I warned you, Headmaster. It is impossible to have rules without Mr. Potter exploiting them. For long precious seconds, as the 47 soldiers charged her own 17, Hermione's mind went blank.
What?
Then it all snapped into place. Every time a soldier originally from Sunshine got shot by someone crying the name of Sunshine, she would lose a Quirrell point. When 2 Sunshine soldiers were shot by either army, both enemy armies would be 2 points closer to overtaking her. It was the same gain, only shared. And if anyone shot another soldier not in the name of Sunshine, that gong wouldn't get lost in the confusion. Hermione was suddenly very glad that Zabini hadn't gone with the obvious plan of starting trouble between the other 2 armies while they attacked Sunshine. It was still disheartening, though, That sense of your chances closing down, of hope being taken away. Most of Hermione's soldiers were still looking confused, but some had expressions of dawning horror as they got it. "It's all right," Susan Bones said firmly. Heads turned to look at the Sunshine Captain. "Our job is the same, to take as many of them with us as we can. And remember, Zabini took away all the spies. We don't have to stay on the lookout like they do." The girl was smiling defiantly, provoking answering smiles from many of the other soldiers, even from Hermione herself. "It can be like it was in November. We just have to keep our heads high, fight our best, and trust each other." Daphne shot her. "Blood for the blood god," shrieked Neville of Chaos, though since he was underwater it came out more like blubbled for the blubbled glub. Captain Weasley spun and raised his wand toward Neville and fired. But Neville was swimming downward toward him, wand pointed straight ahead, and that meant the simple shield could shelter Neville's entire profile. If anyone shot him now, it wasn't going to be Sunny Ron. A grimly determined look came over Captain Weasley's face, and he arrowed straight up toward Neville, mouthing the word Contigo, though the shield wasn't visible in the water. The two enemy champions shot toward each other like arrows released from bows, each aimed to split the other down the middle. They had dueled many times before, but this time would pay for all. Far away by the lakeside, 100 breaths were held. "Rainbows and unicorns," roared the Sunshine Captain. "The black goat with 1,000 young. Do your homework." Closer and yet closer, the two champions charged, neither willing to swerve. The first person to turn would present a vulnerable broadside and get shot, though if neither lost their nerve they would crash right into each other. Falling straight down as the enemy rose straight up to meet him, hammer descending to meet anvil in a path neither was willing to leave. Special attack, chaotic twist. Neville saw the look of horror on Captain Weasley's face as the hover charm caught him. They tested it before the battle had started, and just as Harry had suspected, Wingardium Leviosa became a whole new sort of weapon once everyone was swimming underwater. "Curse you, Longbottom," shrieked Ron Weasley. "Can't you ever fight without your dumb special attacks, And by that time the Sunshine Captain had been spun around sideways and Neville shot him in the leg. "I don't fight fair," said Neville to the sleeping form. "I fight like Harry Potter." Granger, 237/Malfoy, 217/Potter, 220. It still hurt every time he had to shoot Hermione. Harry could hardly stand to look at the expression of peace that had come over her sleeping face, arms now drifting aimlessly as the curves of sunlight moved over her camouflage uniform and the cloud of her chestnut hair. And if Harry had tried to duck out of being the one to shoot her, not only would Draco have known what it meant, Hermione would have been offended. "She's not dead," Harry said to his brain as his kicking feet pushed him away. "She's just resting." "Idiot. Are you sure?" said his brain. "What if she's an ex-Hermione? Could we go back and check?" Harry glanced back briefly. "See, she's fine. There are bubbles coming out of her mouth. Could have been her last breath escaping." "Oh, be quiet. Why are you being so paranoid protective anyway?" "Air. First real friend we've ever had in our whole life? Hey, remember what happened to our pet rock? Would you shut up about that worthless lump of rubble? It wasn't even alive, let alone sentient. That is like the most pathetic childhood trauma ever." The two armies swiftly separated, becoming two shoals of fish once more. General Granger had gone down 17 points and taken 3 chaotics and 2 dragons with her, and 1 chaotic and 2 dragons had been shot as traitors. So she'd lost net 7 points. Harry had lost 1. Draco had lost 2. That put Sunshine 20 points up on Dragon, and 17 points up on Chaos. Chaos could still win easily if they exterminated all 20 remaining dragons. The wild card, of course, being those 7 remaining Sunshine soldiers. If you could call them that. The two shoals swam uneasily next to each other, the soldiers in each army awaiting an order to call out their true allegiances and attack. "Everyone who got them," Harry said loudly, "remember Special Orders 1 through 3. And don't forget it's Merlin says on 3. Do not acknowledge." The trustworthy 2/3 of the army did not nod, and the other third just looked puzzled. "Special Order 1. Don't bother trying to call out any code words in this battle. Don't expend effort on any plot not specially approved by the commander. Just swim, shield, and fire." Hermione and Draco had both been fighting their soldiers, trying to get them to stop plotting on their own all through December. Harry had egged his soldiers on and supported their plotting through the last 2 battles, while also telling them that at some future point he might ask them to put a plot or 2 on hold, to which they'd all readily agreed. So now, in this critical battle, they were happy to obey. Neither Hermione or Draco could have given that order successfully, Harry was certain. It was the difference between your soldiers seeing you as an ally in their plotting and seeing you as a spoil-sport old fuddy-duddy who didn't want them to have any fun. Imposition of order equaled escalation of chaos, and it also worked in reverse. "There they are," shouted someone and pointed. From the depths of the lake arose the forgotten ones, the ones who'd forsaken the last battle, the 7 missing Sunshine Soldiers, glowing with the bright aura of cowards, now fading as they returned to battle. The 2 shoals of fish wavered, pointing wands uneasily. "Hold your fire," shouted Harry, and a similar cry came from General Malfoy. There was a moment of held breath. Then the 7 Sunshine Soldiers swam up to join Dragon Army. There was a triumphant cheer from Dragon Army. There were cries of dismay from a third of the Chaos Legion. Some of the other 2/3 smiled, though they shouldn't have. Harry wasn't smiling. Oh, this is so completely not going to work. But Harry hadn't been able to think of anything better. "Special Orders 2 and 3 still apply," shouted Harry. "Fight!" For the Chaos Legion, roared 20 Chaotic Legionnaires. For Dragon Army, roared 20 Dragon Warriors and 7 Sunshine Soldiers. And the Chaotix dived straight downward, as all the traitors got ready to strike. Granger, 237/Malfoy, 220/Potter, 226. Draco's had darted around frantically, trying to weigh up what was happening. Somehow, despite his greater forces, he'd lost the initiative. For small chaotic forces were being pursued by 4 larger dragon forces, but because Draco's forces were the ones trying to force an engagement, it meant that they had to follow where chaos ran, and somehow that was producing concentrations of chaotic force that would fire into the exposed sides of Dragon. It was happening again. "Prismatus," shouted Draco, raising his wand, and that shield you could see even through the water, a sparkling, multicolored flat wall wide enough to shield Draco and the 5 other dragons with him from the chaotic force that had just started firing on them as they swam past, and that let the other 5 dragons turn their attentions back to the chaotic force they'd been chasing. There was a tense moment as sleep spell after sleep spell crashed into Draco's prismatic wall, and Draco was hoping to Merlin that none of those 4 chaotics had learned the breaking drill hex. Then there was the bell of a dragon victory, and the chaotic force spun head for foot and began swimming away, and Draco, his hands now shaking slightly, dropped the prismatic wall and lowered his wand. Fighting in water was more exhausting even than fighting on broomsticks. "Do not pursue," Draco cried to his soldiers as they started to follow. Then, "Sonorous, reform on me." The dragon forces started converging on Draco, and the chaotic forces spun around and began pursuing the dragons on the instant. Draco swore out loud as he heard the bell of a chaotic victory. Someone hadn't gotten their simple shield oriented right. And then the dragon forces were in supporting range of each other, and the chaotics were moving back into the murky distance. Somehow, despite their numerical superiority, The dragons had scored 3 times against the chaotics, and the chaotics had scored 4 times back, and he'd heard one dragon spy get executed. Either Harry Potter had thought of a lot of very good ideas very fast, or for some unimaginable reason, he'd already spent a lot of time working out how to fight underwater. This wasn't working, and Draco needed to rethink things. It looked like everyone was having trouble aiming while swimming, too. The battle might last long enough that time would be called. The distant underwater moon was only half full now. That wasn't good. He had to rethink things fast. "What is it?" said Padma Patil, as she and her force swam over toward Draco. Padma was his second in command. She was clever and powerful, and better yet, she hated Granger and saw Harry as a rival, which made her trustworthy. Working with Padma was making him realize the truth of the old adage that Ravenclaw was sister to Slytherin. Draco had been surprised when his father had told him it was an acceptable house for his future wife, but now he saw the sense of it. "Wait until we're all here," Draco said. The truth was, he needed to catch his breath. That was the trouble with being the general and the most powerful wizard. You had to keep using magic. Zabini came in next, commanding a force of 2 Sunnies and 4 dragons, one of whom was Gregory, keeping an eye on Zabini. Draco didn't trust Zabini, and neither Draco nor Zabini trusted the Sunnies enough to make them a majority of any unit. They were supposed to be loyal either to Draco directly, or to Granger, who'd been fooled by the promise that the dragons would be betrayed in the end after both forces had been depleted. Just as Harry's more trusted chaotics should have been fooled into not shooting at the Sunnies by the promise of their firing fake sleep hexes and switching to support chaos later. But it was possible some of the Sunnies were loyal to chaos and weren't firing real sleep hexes, and that was why Dragon wasn't winning the way their numerical advantage should have let them win. The next unit that approached was depleted, 3 soldiers holding wands on 2 other soldiers, who were swimming with empty hands. Draco gritted his teeth. More traitor problems. He needed to talk to Professor Quirrell about having some way to punish traitors at least. Conditions like these were unrealistic. In real life, you tortured your traitors to death. "General Malfoy," shouted the commander of the problem unit as it swam up, a Ravenclaw boy named Terry. "We don't know what to do." Seasai shot Bogdan, but Seasai says Kella told him that Bogdan shot Spectre Dash. "I didn't," said Kella. "Yes, you did," shrieked Seasai. "General Malfoy. She's the spy. I should have REA'd Dash." "Somnium," said Draco. There was the triple bell of a 1-point loss from Dragon, and then Kella's limp body began to float away in the water. Draco had heard the word recursion by this point, and he knew a Harry Potter plot when he saw one. Unfortunately, Draco had not heard of autoimmune disorders, and the thought did not readily occur to him that a clever virus would begin its attack by creating symptoms of an autoimmune disorder so as to get the body to distrust its own immune system. "General order," said Draco, raising his voice. "Nobody gets to shoot spies except myself, Gregory, Padma, and Terry. If anyone sees anything suspicious, they come to one of us." And then there was the bell of Sunshine scoring 2 points. "What?" said Draco and Zabini around the same time. Their heads swiveled around. No one seemed to have gotten hit, and all the Sunshine soldiers were present and accounted for. Except Parvati, who had been shot by some still unknown traitor in Padma's squad. And of course Padma had shot Parvati again in case she was faking, so it wasn't her. "A Sunny traitor in chaos," said Zabini, sounding puzzled. "But all the ones I knew about were supposed to strike during Chaos's attack on Sunshine Dash." "No," said Padma in a tone of sudden realization. "That was Chaos executing a spy." "What?" said Zabini. "But why Dash?" And Draco got it. Damn it. Because Potter thinks he's safe for how much he beats Sunshine, but not for how much he beats us. So, he doesn't want to lose a single point when he executes a traitor. General order. If you have to execute a traitor, call Sunshine first. And don't forget to switch back to Dragon afterward dash. Granger, 253/Malfoy, 252/Potter, 252. Longbottom's body drifted chaotically through the water, arms and legs disarrayed. After Draco had finally got a hit and they'd all shot him again just to be sure. Nearby was Harry Potter, now protected by a prismatic sphere, looking at them all grimly as the last sliver of crescent moon slowly diminished, somewhere far away. If Longbottom had managed to shoot one more soldier, Draco knew Harry was thinking, if the two chaotics had managed to hold out just a little longer, they might have won. After Draco had reformed his forces and struck out again, the ensuing battle and execution of spies in Sunshine's name had left Sunshine exactly 1 point ahead of Dragon and Chaos both. Once Harry had started doing it, Draco had been left with no choice but to follow suit. But now they had General Chaos outnumbered 3-1, the survivors of Dragon Army and the last remaining Sunny traitor, Draco and Padma and Zabini. And Draco, who was no fool, had ordered Padma to take Zabini's wand after Longbottom had shot Gregory and fallen and turned to Draco. The boy had given him an insulted look, told Draco that he owed him for this, and handed it over. That left Draco and Padma to take down General Chaos. "I don't suppose you'd like to surrender," said Draco, smiling as evilly as any smile he'd ever directed at Harry Potter. "Sleep before surrender," shouted General Chaos. "Just so you know," said Draco, "Zabini doesn't actually have an older sister for you to rescue from Gryffindor bullies. But Zabini does have a mother who doesn't approve of Muggleborns like Granger, and I wrote her a few notes and offered Zabini a few favors. Nothing involving my father, just things I can do in school. And by the way, Zabini's mother doesn't approve of the boy who lived, either. Just in case you still thought Zabini was really on your side." Harry's face grew even grimmer. Draco raised his wand and began breathing rhythmically, building up strength for a breaking drill hex. Granger's prismatic sphere was almost as strong as Draco's now, and Harry's wasn't much weaker. Where did those two find time? "Lagan," spoke Draco, putting everything he had into it, and the green spiral blazed out and Harry's shield shattered, and at almost the same moment. "Somnium," said Padma. Granger, 253/Malfoy, 252/Potter, 254. Harry let out a long breath of relief, and not just because he didn't have to hold the prismatic sphere anymore. His hand was shaking as he lowered his wand. "You know," said Harry, "I was pretty worried there for a moment. Special order too. If a Sunny traitor doesn't seem to be really shooting at you, fake being hit occasionally. Prefer targeting dragons to Sunnies, but go ahead and shoot Sunnies if you can't shoot dragons. Special Order 3. Merlin says do not shoot at Blaze Zabini or either Patil twin." With a wide grin, Parvati Patil stripped the transfigured patch off her uniform's insignia and let it float away in the water. "Gryffindors for chaos," she said, and handed Zabini his wand back. "Thank you very much," Harry said and bowed sweepingly to the Gryffindor girl. "And thank you as well," bowing to Zabini. "You know, when you came to me with that plan, I wondered if you were brilliant or crazy, and I've decided that you're both. And by the way," Harry said, now turning as though to address Draco's body, "Zabini does have a cousin Dash." "Somnium," said Zabini's voice. Granger, 255/Malfoy, 252/Potter, 254. And Harry Potter's body floated away, his expression of shock and horror quickly relaxing into sleep. On second thought, Parvati said cheerfully, "Make that Gryffindors for Sunshine." She started to laugh, more exhilarated than she'd ever been in her life. She'd finally gotten to assassinate and replace her twin sister, and she'd wanted to do that since forever. And this had been perfect. It had all been perfect. And then her wand spun around in a lightning motion just as Zabini's wand turned to point at her. "Wait," said Zabini. "Do not shoot, do not resist." "That's an order." "What?" said Parvati. "Sorry," said Zabini, looking not quite sincerely apologetic, "but I can't be totally sure you're for sunshine. So, I order you to let me shoot you." "Hold on," said Parvati. "We're only ahead of chaos by 1 point. If you shoot me now, dash." "I'll shoot you in the name of dragon, obviously," said Zabini, now sounding a little superior. "Just because we tricked them into doing it doesn't mean it won't work for us." Parvati stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "General Malfoy said your mother doesn't like Hermione." "I suppose," said Zabini, still with that superior smirk. "But some of us are more willing than Draco Malfoy to annoy a parent. And Harry Potter said you have a cousin Dash." "Nope," said Zabini. Parvati stared at him, trying to think, but she wasn't really good at plotting. Zabini said the plan was to secretly keep the scores of Chaos and Dragon as even as possible, so they'd use Sunshine's name to execute their traitors instead of losing even a single point. And that had worked, but she had the feeling she was missing something. She wasn't a Slytherin. "Why don't I shoot you in the name of Dragon?" said Parvati. "Because I outrank you," said Zabini. Parvati had a bad feeling about this. She stared at him for a long moment. And then, "Somni Dash," she started to say, and then realized she hadn't said for dragon, and frantically cut herself off. "Granger, 255/Malfoy, 254/Potter, 254. "Hey, everyone," said Blaze, Zabini's face on the screens, looking quite amused. "Guess it's all down to me." All by the lakeside, people were holding their breath. Sunshine was ahead of Dragon and Chaos by exactly 1 point. Blaze Zabini could shoot himself in the name of either Dragon or Chaos, or just leave things the way they were. A series of chimes indicated that the last minute of time was running out, and the Slytherin was smiling a strange, twisted smile and casually toying with his wand, the dark wood barely visible in the dark water. "You know," said Blaze Zabini's voice, in the tones of someone who'd been rehearsing the words for a while, "it's just a game, really. And games are supposed to be fun. So how about if I just do whatever I feel like?" 34. Coordination problems. Point 2. Minerva and Dumbledore together had applied their combined talent to conjure the grand stage toward which Quirrell now slowly trudged. It was, at its core, sturdy wood, but the outer surfaces shone with glitter of marble inlaid with platinum and studded with gems of every house color. Neither she nor the headmaster was any founder of Hogwarts, but the conjuration only needed to last a few hours. Minerva ordinarily enjoyed the few occasions when she had the occasion to tire herself out on large transfigurations. She should have enjoyed the many small chances for artistry and the illusion of opulence, but this time she had done the work with the dreadful feeling of digging her own grave. But Minerva was feeling a little better now. There'd been one brief moment when the explosion might have come, but Dumbledore had already been standing up and applauding warmly, and no one had proven foolish enough to riot in front of the headmaster. And the explosive mood had rapidly faded into a collective sentiment which might perhaps have been described by the phrase, "Give us a break." Blaze Zabini had shot himself in the name of Sunshine, and the final score had been 254 to 254 to 254. Behind the stage, waiting to ascend, 3 children were glaring at each other in mingled fury and frustration. It didn't help that they were still damp from being fished out of the lake, and that the warming charms didn't seem quite enough to make up for the crisp December air, or maybe it was just their mood. "That's it," said Granger. "I've had it. No more traitors." "I completely agree with you, Miss Granger," Draco said icily. "Enough is enough." "And what do you two intend to do about it?" snapped Harry Potter. "Professor Quirrell already said he wouldn't ban spies." "We'll ban them for him," said Draco grimly. He hadn't even understood what he meant by the words as he said them, but the very act of speaking seemed to crystallize a plan. The stage really was well done, at least for a temporary structure. The makers hadn't fallen into the usual pitfall of being impressed by their own illusion of wealth and knew something about architecture and visual style. From where Draco stood, in the obvious place for him to stand, the watching students would see him haloed in the faint glitter of emeralds, and Granger, standing where Draco had subtly motioned her, would be haloed in Ravenclaw's sapphire. As for Harry Potter, Draco wasn't looking at him right now. Professor Quirrell had awakened, or whatever it was he did, and was leaning upon a platinum podium bare of all gems. With evident showmanship, the defense professor was carefully stacking and squaring those 3 envelopes containing the 3 parchments upon which the 3 generals had written their wishes, as all the students of Hogwarts watched and waited. Finally, Professor Quirrell looked up from the envelopes. "Well," said the defense professor, "this is inconvenient." A slight titter of laughter ran through the crowd, with a sharp undertone. "I suppose you are all wondering what I will do," said Professor Quirrell. "There is nothing for it. I shall have to do what is fair. Although first there was a little speech I wanted to make, and before even that it appears to me that Mr. Malfoy and Miss Granger have something they wish to share." Draco blinked, and then he and Granger traded rapid glances. "May I?" "Yes, go ahead." And Draco raised his voice. "General Granger and I would both like to say," Draco said in his most formal voice, knowing it was being amplified and heard, "that we will no longer accept the help of any traitors. And if, in any battle, we find that Potter has accepted traitors from either of our armies, we will join forces to crush him." And Draco shot a glance filled at malice at the boy who lived. "Take that, General Chaos." "I agree completely with General Malfoy," said Granger standing beside him, her high voice clear and strong. "Neither of us will use traitors, and if General Potter does, we will wipe him off the battlefield." There was a susurration of surprise from the watching students. "Very good," said their defense professor, smiling. "It took the 2 of you long enough, but you are still to be congratulated on having thought of it before any other generals. It took a moment for this to soak in. In the future, Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, before you come to my office with any request, consider whether there is a way for you to accomplish it without my help. I will not deduct Quirrell points on this occasion, but next time you may expect to lose the full 50. Professor Quirrell wore an amused grin. "And what do you have to say about that, Mr. Potter?" Harry Potter's gaze went to Granger, then to Draco. His face appeared calm, though Draco was sure controlled would have been the better term. Finally, Harry Potter spoke, his voice level. "The Chaos Legion is still happy to accept traitors. See you on the battlefield." Draco knew the shock was showing on his own face. There were astonished murmurs from the watching students, and when Draco glanced at the front row, he saw that even Harry's chaotics looked taken aback. Granger's face was angry and getting angrier. "Mr. Potter," she said in a sharp tone like she thought she was a teacher, "are you trying to be obnoxious?" "Most certainly not," Harry Potter said calmly. "I won't make you do it every time. Beat me once and I'll stay beaten. But threats aren't always enough, General of Sunshine. You did not ask me to join with you, but tried simply to impose your will, and sometimes you must actually defeat the enemy to impose your will on him. You see, I am skeptical that Hermione Granger, the brightest academic star of Hogwarts, and Draco, son of Lucius, scion of the noble and most ancient house of Malfoy, can work together to beat their common foe, Harry Potter." An amused smile crossed Harry Potter's face. "Maybe I'll just do what Draco tried with Zabini and write a letter to Lucius Malfoy and see what he thinks about that." "Harry," gasped Granger, looking absolutely aghast, and there were gasps from the audience as well. Draco controlled the anger flushing through him. That had been a stupid move on Harry's part, saying that in public. If Harry had simply done it, it might have worked. Draco hadn't even thought about that, but now if Father did that, it would look like he was playing into Harry's hands. If you think my father, Lord Malfoy, can be manipulated by you that easily, Draco said coldly, you have a surprise coming, Harry Potter. And Draco realized as the words finished leaving his mouth that he'd just backed his own father squarely into the corner, more or less without even meaning to. Father probably wasn't going to like this, not the tiniest bit, but now it would be impossible for him to say so. Draco would have to apologize for that. It had been an honest accident, but it was strange to think that he'd done it at all. Then go ahead and defeat the evil General Chaos, Harry said, still looking amused. I can't win against both your armies, not if you really work together. But I wonder if perhaps I could break you up before then. You won't, and we'll crush you, said Draco Malfoy. And beside him, Hermione Granger firmly nodded. Well, said Professor Quirrell after the astounded silence had stretched for a while. That was not how I expected that particular conversation to go. The defense professor had a rather intrigued expression on his face. Truthfully, Mr. Potter, I expected you to concede immediately, and with a smile, then announce that you had long since worked out my intended lesson but had decided not to spoil it for others. Indeed, I plan my speech accordingly, Mr. Potter. Harry Potter just shrugged. Sorry about that, he said, and said nothing more. Oh, don't worry, said Professor Quirrell. This, too, will serve. And Professor Quirrell turned from the three children and straightened at the podium to address the whole watching crowd. His customary air of detached amusement dropped away like a falling mask, and when he spoke again his voice was amplified louder than it had been. If not for Harry Potter, said Professor Quirrell, his voice as crisp and cold as December, you know who would have won? The silence was instant and total. Make no mistake, said Professor Quirrell. The Dark Lord was winning. There were fewer and fewer Aurors who dared face him. The vigilantes who opposed him were being hunted down. One Dark Lord and perhaps 50 Death Eaters were winning against a country of thousands. That is beyond ridiculous. There are no grades low enough for me to mark that incompetence. There was a frown on the face of Headmaster Dumbledore, and on the faces of the audience, puzzlement, and the utter silence went on. Do you understand now how it happened? You saw it today. I allowed traitors, and gave the generals no means to restrain them. You saw the result. Clever plots and clever betrayals, until the last soldier left on the battlefield shot himself. You cannot possibly doubt that all three of those armies could have been defeated by any outside foe that was unified within itself. Professor Quirrell leaned forward at the podium, his voice now filled with a grim intensity. His right hand stretched out, fingers open and spread. Division is weakness, said the defense professor. His hand closed into a tight fist. Unity is strength. The Dark Lord understood that well, whatever his other follies, and he used that understanding to create the one simple invention that made him the most terrible Dark Lord in history. Your parents faced one Dark Lord, and 50 Death Eaters who were perfectly unified, knowing that any breach of their loyalty would be punished by death, that any slack or incompetence would be punished by pain. None could escape the Dark Lord's grasp once they took his mark. And the Death Eaters agreed to take that terrible mark because they knew that once they took it, they would be united, facing a divided land. One Dark Lord and 50 Death Eaters would have defeated an entire country by the power of the Dark Mark. Professor Quirrell's voice was bleak and hard. Your parents could have fought back in kind. They did not. There was a man named Yermy Wibble who called upon the nation to institute a draft, though he did not quite have vision enough to propose a Mark of Britain. Yermy Wibble knew what would happen to him. He hoped his death would inspire others. So the Dark Lord took his family, for good measure. Their empty skins inspired nothing but fear, and no one dared to speak again. And your parents would have faced the consequences of their despicable cowardice, if not for being saved by a 1-year-old boy. Professor Quirrell's face showed full contempt. A dramatist would have called that a deus ex machina, for they did nothing to earn their salvation. He who must not be named may not have deserved to win, but make no doubt of it, your parents deserve to lose. The voice of the defense professor rang forth like iron. And know this, your parents have learned nothing. The nation is still fragmented and weak. How few decades passed between Grindelwald and you-know-who. Do you think you will not see the next threat in your own lifetimes? Will you repeat then the follies of your parents, when you have seen the results so clearly laid out before you this day? For I can tell you what your parents will do when the day of darkness comes. I can tell you what lesson they have learned. They have learned to hide like cowards and do nothing while they wait for Harry Potter to save them. There was a wondering look in the eyes of Headmaster Dumbledore, and other students gazed up at their defense professor with bewilderment and anger and awe. Professor Quirrell's eyes were as cold now as his voice. Mark this and mark it well. He who must not be named wished to rule over this country, to hold it in his cruel grasp forever. But at least he wished to rule over a living country, and not a heap of ash. There have been dark lords who are mad, who wished only to make the world a vast funeral pyre. There have been wars in which one whole country marched against another. Your parents nearly lost against 100 who thought to take this country alive. How quickly would they have been crushed by a foe more numerous than they, a foe that cared for nothing but their destruction. This I foretell. When the next threat rises, Lucius Malfoy will claim that you must follow him or perish, that your only hope is to trust in his cruelty and strength. And though Lucius Malfoy himself will believe it, this will be a lie. For when the Dark Lord perished, Lucius Malfoy did not unite the Death Eaters. They were shattered in an instant. They fled like whipped dogs and betrayed each other. Lucius Malfoy is not strong enough to be a true lord, dark or otherwise. Draco Malfoy's fists were clenched white. There were tears in his eyes, and fury, and unbearable shame. No, said Professor Quirrell, I do not think it will be Lucius Malfoy who saves you. And lest you think that I speak on my own behalf, time will make clear soon enough that this is not so. I make you no recommendation, my students. But I say that if a whole country were to find a leader as strong as the Dark Lord, but honorable and pure, and take his mark, then they could crush any Dark Lord like an insect, and all the rest of our divided magical world could not threaten them. And if some still greater enemy rose against us in a war of extermination, then only a united magical world could survive. There were gasps, mostly from Muggleborns. The students in green-trimmed robes looked merely puzzled. Now it was Harry Potter, whose fists were clenched tight and trembling, and Hermione Granger beside him was angry and dismayed. The headmaster rose from his seat, his face now stern, saying no word as yet, but the command was clear. I do not say what threat will come, said Professor Quirrell, but you will not live all your lives in peace, not if the past history of the world is any guide at all to its future. And if you do in the future as you have seen 3 armies do this day, if you cannot throw aside your petty bickering and take the mark of a single leader, then indeed you might wish that the Dark Lord had lived to rule over you, and regret the day that ever Harry Potter was born. Enough, bellowed Albus Dumbledore. There was silence. Professor Quirrell slowly turned his head to gaze at where Albus Dumbledore stood in the fury of his wizardry. Their eyes met, and a soundless stress pressed down like weight upon all the students as they listened, not daring to move. You, too, failed this country, said Professor Quirrell. And you know the peril as well as I. Such speeches are not for the ears of students, said Albus Dumbledore in a dangerously rising voice. nor for the mouths of professors. Dryly, then, Professor Quirrell spoke. There were many speeches made for the ears of adults as the Dark Lord rose, and the adults clapped and cheered and went home having enjoyed their day's entertainment. But I will obey you, headmaster, and make no further speeches if you do not like them. My lesson is simple. I will go on doing nothing about traitors, and we will see what students can do for themselves about that when they do not wait for professors to save them. And then Professor Quirrell turned back to his students, and his mouth quirked up in a wry grin that seemed to dissipate the dreadful pressure, like a god blowing to scatter the clouds. But do please be kind to the traitors up until now, said Professor Quirrell. They were just having fun. There was laughter, though it was nervous at first, and then it seemed to build, as Professor Quirrell stood there smiling wryly, and some of the tension released itself. Draco's mind was still whirling through 1,000 questions and a daze of horror, as Professor Quirrell prepared to open the envelopes in which the three had inscribed their wishes. It had never before occurred to Draco that moon-traveling muggles were a greater threat than the slow decline of wizardry, or that Father had proven himself too weak to stop them. And even stranger, the obvious implication, Professor Quirrell believed that Harry could. The defense professor claimed to have made no recommendation, but he'd mentioned Harry Potter over and over in his speech. Others would already be thinking the same thing as Draco. It was ridiculous. The boy who had covered a stuffed chair in glitter and called it a throne. The boy who faced down Snape and won, whispered a traitorous voice. That boy could grow into a lord strong enough to rule, strong enough to save us all. Harry had been raised by muggles. He was practically a mudblood himself. He wouldn't fight against his adopted family. He knows their arts, their secrets, and their methods. He can take all of the muggles' science and use it against them, alongside our own power as wizards. But what if he refuses? What if he's too weak? Then, said that inner voice, "It will have to be you, won't it, Draco Malfoy?" And then there was a renewed hush from the crowd as Professor Quirrell opened the first envelope. "Mr. Malfoy," said Professor Quirrell, "your wish is for Slytherin to win the House Cup." There was a puzzled pause from the watching audience. "Yes, Professor," said Draco in a clear voice, knowing that it was once again being amplified. "If you can't do that, then something else for Slytherin Dash." "I will not award house points unfairly," said Professor Quirrell. He tapped a cheek, looking thoughtful. "Which makes your wish difficult enough to be interesting. Would you like to say anything about why, Mr. Malfoy?" Draco turned from the defense professor, gazed out at the crowd from against that backdrop of platinum and emeralds. Not all of Slytherin had cheered for Dragon Army. There were anti-Malfoy factions who had expressed that dissatisfaction by supporting the boy who lived, or even Granger, and those factions would be encouraged greatly by what Zabini had done. He needed to remind them that Slytherin meant Malfoy and Malfoy meant Slytherin. "No," said Draco. "They're Slytherins. They'll understand." There was some laughter from the audience, especially in Slytherin, even from some students who would have called themselves anti-Malfoy a moment earlier. Flattery was a lovely thing. Draco turned back to look at Professor Quirrell again, and was surprised to see an embarrassed look on Granger's face. "And for Miss Granger," said Professor Quirrell. There was the sound of a tearing envelope. "Your wish is for Ravenclaw to win the House Cup." There was considerable laughter from the audience, including a chuckle from Draco. He hadn't thought Granger played that game. "Well, said Granger, sounding like she was suddenly stumbling over a memorized speech. "I meant to say that." She took a deep breath. "There were soldiers from every house in my army, and I don't mean to slight any of them. But houses should still count for something, too. It was sad when students in the same house were hexing each other just because they were in different armies. People should be able to rely on whoever's in their house. That's why Godric Gryffindor and Salazar Slytherin and Rowena Ravenclaw and Helga Hufflepuff created the 4 houses of Hogwarts in the first place. I'm the General of Sunshine, but even before that, I'm Hermione Granger of Ravenclaw, and I'm proud to be part of a house that's 800 years old. Well said, Miss Granger, said Dumbledore's booming voice. Harry Potter was frowning, and something tickled at the edge of Draco's recognition. An interesting sentiment, Miss Granger, said Professor Quirrell. But there are times when it is good for a Slytherin to have friends in Ravenclaw, or for a Gryffindor to have friends in Hufflepuff. Surely it would be best if you could rely both on your friends in your house and also your friends in your armies. Granger's eyes flicked briefly toward the watching students and teachers, and she said nothing. Professor Quirrell nodded as though to himself, and then turned back to the podium and took up and tore open the last envelope. Beside Draco, Harry Potter visibly tensed up as the defense professor drew forth the parchment. And Mr. Potter wishes for dash. There was a pause as Professor Quirrell looked at the parchment. Then, without any change of expression on Professor Quirrell's face, the sheet of parchment burst into flames and burned with a brief, intense fire that left only drifting black dust sprinkling down from his hand. Please confine yourself to the possible, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, sounding very dry indeed. There was a long pause. Harry, standing beside Draco, looked rather shaken. What in Merlin's name did he ask for? I do hope, said Professor Quirrell, that you prepared another wish. If I could not grant that one. There was another pause. Harry drew a deep breath. I didn't, he said, but I already thought of another one. Harry Potter turned to look out at the audience, and his voice firmed as he spoke. People fear traitors because of the damage the traitor does directly, the soldiers they shoot, or the secrets they tell. But that's only part of the danger. What people do because they're afraid of traitors also costs them. I used that strategy today against Sunshine and Dragon. I didn't tell my traitors to cause as much direct damage as possible. I told them to act in the way that would create the most distrust and confusion, and make the generals do the most costly things to try and stop them from doing it again. When there are just a few traitors and a whole country opposing them, it stands to reason that what a few traitors do might be less damaging than what a whole country does to stop them, that the cure might be worse than the disease dash. Mr. Potter, said the defense professor, his voice suddenly cutting, the lesson of history is that you are simply wrong. Your parents' generation did too little to unify themselves, not too much. This whole country almost fell, Mr. Potter, though you were not there to see it. I suggest that you ask your dormmates in Ravenclaw how many of them have lost family to the Dark Lord. Or if you are wiser, do not ask. Do you have a wish to make, Mr. Potter? If you don't mind, said the mild voice of Albus Dumbledore, I should like to hear what the boy who lived has to say. He has more experience than either of us at stopping wars. A few people laughed, but not many. Harry Potter's gaze moved to Dumbledore, and he looked considering for a moment. I'm not saying you're wrong, Professor Quirrell. In the last war, people didn't act together, and a whole country almost fell to a few dozen attackers, and yes, that was pathetic. And if we make the same mistake next time, yes, that'll be even more pathetic. But you never fight the same war twice. And the problem is, the enemy is also allowed to be smart. If you're divided, you're vulnerable in one way. But when you try to unite, then you face other risks and other costs, and the enemy will try to take advantage of those too. You can't stop thinking at just one level of the game. Simplicity also has a great deal to commend it, Mr. Potter, said the dry voice of the defense professor. I do hope that you have learned something this day about the dangers of strategies more complicated than uniting your people and attacking your enemy. And if all this does not tie into your wish somehow, I shall be quite annoyed. Yes, said Harry Potter, it was pretty difficult coming up with a wish to symbolize the costs of unity. But the problem of acting together isn't just for wars. It's something we have to solve all our lives, every day. If everyone is coordinating using the same rules, and the rules are stupid, then if one person decides to do things differently, they're breaking the rules. But if everyone decides to do things differently, they can. It's exactly the same problem of everyone needing to act together. But for the first person who speaks out, it seems like they're going against the crowd. And if you thought that the only important thing was that people should always be unified, then you could never change the game, no matter how stupid the rules. So my own wish, to symbolize what happens when people unite in the wrong direction, is that in Hogwarts we should play Quidditch, without the snitch. What? Screamed 100 voices in the crowd, as Draco's jaw dropped. The snitch ruins the whole game, said Harry Potter. Everything the other players do ends up being irrelevant. It would make overwhelmingly more sense to just buy a clock. It's one of those incredibly stupid things you don't notice just because you grew up with it, that people only do because everyone else is doing it dash. But by that point, Harry Potter's voice could no longer be heard because the riot had started. The riot ended around 15 seconds later, after a gigantic spout of fire blasted out of the highest tower of Hogwarts to the sound of 100 thunders. Draco hadn't known Dumbledore could do that. The students sat down again very carefully and quietly. Professor Quirrell was laughing without pause. So be it, Mr. Potter. Your will be done. The defense professor paused deliberately. Of course, I only promised one cunning plot. And that is all that the three of you will get. Draco had been half expecting the words earlier, but now they still came as a shock. Draco exchanged rapid glances with Granger. They would have been the obvious allies, but their wishes were directly opposed. You mean, said Harry, we have to all agree on a wish? Oh, that would be far too much to ask, said Professor Quirrell. The three of you have no common enemy, do you? And for one brief moment, so fast that Draco thought he might have imagined it, the defense professor's eyes flicked in the direction of Dumbledore. No, said Professor Quirrell. I mean that I shall grant 3 wishes using a single plot. There was a confused silence. You can't do that, Harry said flatly from beside Draco. Not even I can do that. 2 of those wishes are mutually incompatible. It's logically impossible dash, and then Harry cut himself off. You're a few years too young to tell me what I can't do, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, with a brief, dry smile. Then the defense professor turned back to the watching students. Truthfully, I have no confidence in your ability to learn this day's lesson. Go home and enjoy your time with your families, or what's left of them, while they still live. My own family is long since dead at the Dark Lord's hand. I shall see you all when classes resume. In the speechless silence that resulted, Professor Quirrell already turning to walk off the stage, Draco heard the defense professor's voice say, quietly and no longer amplified, "But you, Mr. Potter, I would speak to now." 35. Coordination problems. Point 3. They had gone to the defense professor's office, and Professor Quirrell had sealed the door before he leaned back in his chair and spoke. The defense professor's voice was very calm, and that unnerved Harry a good deal more than if Professor Quirrell had been shouting. "I am trying," said Professor Quirrell quietly, "to make allowances for the fact that you are young. That I myself, at the same age, was a quite extraordinary fool. You speak with adult style and meddle in adult games, and sometimes I forget that you are only a meddler. I hope, Mr. Potter, that your childish meddling has not just killed you, ruined your country, and lost the next war." It was very hard for Harry to control his breathing. "Professor Quirrell," I said a good deal less than I wished to say, but I had to say something. "Your proposals are extremely alarming to anyone who has the slightest familiarity with Muggle history over the last century. The Italian fascists, some very nasty people, got their name from the fasces, a bundle of rods bound together to symbolize the idea that unity is strength dash. So the nasty Italian fascists believed that unity is stronger than division, said Professor Quirrell. Sharpness was beginning to creep into his voice. Perhaps they also believed that the sky is blue and advocated a policy of not dropping rocks on your head. Reverse stupidity is not intelligence. The world's stupidest person may say the sun is shining, but that doesn't make it dark out. Fine, you're right. That was an ad hominem argument. It's not wrong because the fascists said it. But Professor Quirrell, you can't have everyone in a country take the mark of one dictator. It's a single point of failure. Look, I'll put it this way. Suppose the enemy, just imperious, is whoever controls the mark dash. Powerful wizards are not so easy to imperious, said Professor Quirrell dryly. And if you cannot find a worthy leader, you are in any case doomed. But worthy leaders do exist. The question is whether the people shall follow them. Harry raked his hands through his hair in frustration. He wanted to call a timeout and make Professor Quirrell read the rise and fall of the Third Reich and then start the conversation over again. I don't suppose that if I suggested democracy was a better form of government than dictatorship dash. I see, said Professor Quirrell. His eyes closed briefly, then opened. Mr. Potter, the stupidity of Quidditch is transparent to you because you did not grow up revering the game. If you had never heard of elections, Mr. Potter, and you simply saw what is there, what you saw would not please you. Look to our elected Minister of Magic. Is he the wisest, the strongest, the greatest of our nation? No. He is a buffoon who is owned in fee simple by Lucius Malfoy. Wizards went to the polls and chose between Cornelius Fudge and Tanya Leach, who had competed with each other in a grand and entertaining contest after the Daily Prophet, which Lucius Malfoy also controls, decided that they were the only serious candidates. That Cornelius Fudge was genuinely selected as the best leader our country could offer is not a suggestion anyone could make with a straight face. It is no different in the Muggle world, from what I have heard and seen. The last Muggle newspaper I read mentioned that the previous president of the United States had been a retired movie actor. If you had not grown up with elections, Mr. Potter, they would be as transparently silly to you as Quidditch. Harry sat there with his mouth open, struggling for words. The point of elections isn't to produce the one best leader. It's to keep politicians scared enough of the voters that they don't go completely evil like dictators do dash. The last war, Mr. Potter, was fought between the Dark Lord and Dumbledore. And while Dumbledore was a flawed leader who was losing the war, it is ridiculous to suggest that any of the ministers of magic elected during that period could have taken Dumbledore's place. Strength flows from powerful wizards and their followers, not from elections and the fools they elect. That is the lesson of magical Britain's recent history, and I doubt that the next war will teach you a lesson any different. If you survive it, Mr. Potter, which you will not do unless you abandon the enthusiastic illusions of childhood. If you think there are no dangers in the course of action you advocate, said Harry, and despite everything his voice was growing sharp, then that, too, is childish enthusiasm. Harry stared grimly into Professor Quirrell's eyes, who stared back without blinking. Such dangers, said Professor Quirrell coldly, are to be discussed in offices like this one, not in speeches. The fools who elected Cornelius Fudge are not interested in complications and caution. Present them with anything more nuanced than a rousing cheer, and you will face your war alone. That, Mr. Potter, was your childish error, which Draco Malfoy would not have made even when he was 8 years old. It should have been obvious even to you that you should have stayed silent and consulted with me first, not spoken your worries before the crowd. I am no friend of Albus Dumbledore, said Harry, a cold in his voice to match Professor Quirrell's. But he is no child, and he did not seem to think my concerns were childish, nor that I should have waited to speak them. Oh, said Professor Quirrell, so you take your cues from the headmaster now, do you? And stood up from behind his desk. When Blaise turned the corner on the way to the office, He saw that Professor Quirrell was already leaning against the wall. "Blaise Zabini," said the defense professor, straightening. His eyes were set like dark stones within his face, and his voice sent a shiver of fear down Blaise's spine. "He can't do anything against me. I just have to remember that." "I believe," said Professor Quirrell, in a clear, cold voice, "that I have already guessed the name of your employer. But I would hear it from your own lips, and tell me also the price that bought you." Blaise knew he was sweating under his robes, and that the moisture would be already visible on his forehead. "I got a chance to show I was better than all 3 generals, and I took it. A lot of people hate me now, but there are also plenty of Slytherins who'll love me for it. What makes you think I'm Dash? You did not devise the plan of today's battle, Mr. Zabini. Tell me who did." Blaise swallowed hard. "Well, I mean, in that case, then you already know who did, right? The only one who's that crazy is Dumbledore. And he'll protect me if you try to do anything." "Indeed. Tell me the price." The defense professor's eyes were still hard. "It's my cousin Kimberly," Blaise said, swallowing again and trying to control his voice. "She's real, and she's really being bullied." Potter checked that he wasn't dumb. Only Dumbledore said that he'd nudged the bullies into doing it, just for the plan, and if I worked for him, she'd be fine afterward. But if I did go with Potter, there was more trouble Kimberly could get into. Professor Quirrell was silent for a long moment. "I see," Professor Quirrell said, his voice now much milder. "Mr. Zabini, should such an event occur again, you may contact me directly. I have my own ways of protecting my friends. Now, a final question. Even with all the power you took into your hands, forcing a tie would have been difficult. Did Dumbledore instruct you as to who should win otherwise?" "Sunshine," said Blaise. Professor Quirrell nodded. "As I thought." The defense professor sighed. "In your future career, Mr. Zabini, I do not suggest trying any plots that complicated. They have a tendency to fail." I said that to the headmaster, actually," Blaise said, "and he said that was why it was important to have more than one plot going at a time." Professor Quirrell passed a weary hand across his forehead. "It's a wonder the Dark Lord didn't go mad from fighting him. You may go on to your meeting with the headmaster, Mr. Zabini. I will say nothing of this, but if the headmaster should somehow discover that we have spoken, remember my standing offer to give you what protection I can. You are dismissed." Blaise didn't wait for any other word, just turned and fled. Professor Quirrell waited for a time, and then said, "Go ahead, Mr. Potter." Harry tore the cloak of invisibility off his head and stuffed into his pouch. He was trembling with so much rage he could hardly speak. He did what? "You should have deduced it yourself, Mr. Potter," Professor Quirrell said mildly. "You must learn to blur your vision until you can see the forest obscured by the trees. Anyone who heard the stories about you, and who did not know that you were the mysterious boy who lived, could easily deduce your ownership of an invisibility cloak. Step back from these events, blur away their details, and what do we observe? There is a great rivalry between students, and their competition ended in a perfect tie. That sort of thing only happens in stories, Mr. Potter, and there is one person in this school who thinks in stories. There is a strange and complicated plot, which you should have realized was uncharacteristic of the young Slytherin you faced. But there is a person in this school who deals in plots that elaborate, and his name is not Zabini. And I did warn you that there was a quadruple agent. You knew that Zabini was at least a triple agent, and you should have guessed a high chance that it was he. No, I will not declare the battle invalid. All 3 of you failed the test, and lost to your common enemy." Harry didn't care about tests at this point. Dumbledore blackmailed Zabini by threatening his cousin? Just to make our battle end in a tie. Why? Professor Quirrell gave a mirthless laugh. Perhaps the headmaster thought the rivalry was good for his pet hero and wished to see it continue. For the greater good, you understand. Or perhaps he was simply mad. You see, Mr. Potter, everyone knows that Dumbledore's madness is a mask, that he is sane pretending to be insane. They pride themselves on that clever insight, and knowing the secret explanation, they stop looking. It does not occur to them that it is also possible to have a mask behind the mask, to be insane pretending to be sane pretending to be insane. And I am afraid, Mr. Potter, that I have urgent business elsewhere and must depart, but I should strongly advise you not to take your cues from Albus Dumbledore when fighting a war. Until later, Mr. Potter. And the defense professor inclined his head with some irony, and then strode off in the same direction Zabini had fled, while Harry was still standing in open-mouthed shock. Aftermath. Harry Potter. Harry trudged slowly toward the Ravenclaw dorm, eyes unseeing of walls, paintings, or other students. He went upstairs and down ramps without slowing, speeding, or noticing where he trod. It had taken him more than a minute after Professor Quirrell's departure to realize that his only source of information about Dumbledore being involved was A. Blaise Zabini, who he would have to be an absolute gaping idiot to trust again, and B. Professor Quirrell, who could have easily faked a plot in Dumbledore's style, and who might also think that a little student rivalry was a fine thing, and who had, if you stepped back and blurred out the details, just proposed turning the country into a magical dictatorship. And it was also possible that Dumbledore was the one behind Zabini, and that Professor Quirrell had been sincerely trying to fight the Dark Mark-in-kind, and prevent the repetition of a performance he saw as pathetic. Trying to make sure that Harry didn't end up fighting the Dark Lord alone, while everyone else hid, frightened, trying to stay out of the line of fire, waiting for Harry to save them. But the truth was, well, Harry was sort of okay with that. It was, he knew, the kind of thing that was supposed to make heroes resentful and bitter. To heck with that. Harry was very much in favor of everyone else staying out of danger, while the boy who lived took down the Dark Lord by himself, plus or minus a small number of companions. If the next conflict with the Dark Lord got to the point of a second wizarding war that killed lots of people and embroiled a whole country, that would mean Harry had already failed. And if afterward a war broke out between wizards and muggles, it didn't matter who won. Harry would have already failed by letting it get that far. Besides, who said the societies couldn't peacefully integrate when the secrecy inevitably broke down? Though Harry could hear Professor Quirrell's dry voice in his mind, asking him if he was a fool and saying all the obvious things. And if mages and muggles couldn't live in peace, then Harry would combine magic and science and figure out how to evacuate all the wizards to Mars or somewhere, instead of letting a war break out. Because if it did come down to a war of extermination, that was the thing Professor Quirrell hadn't realized, the one most important question he'd forgotten to ask his young general. The real reason why Harry had no intention of being argued into endorsing a light mark, no matter how much it would help him in his fight against the Dark Lord. One Dark Lord and 50 marked followers had been a peril to all of magical Britain. If all Britain took the mark of a strong leader, they would be a peril to the whole magical world. And if the whole wizarding world took a single mark, they would be a danger to the rest of humanity. No one knew quite how many wizards there were in the world. He'd done a few estimates with Hermione and come up with numbers in the rough range of 1 million. But there were 6 billion muggles. If it came down to a final war, Professor Quirrell had forgotten to ask Harry which side he would protect. A scientific civilization, reaching outward, looking upward, knowing that its destiny was to grasp the stars. And a magical civilization, slowly fading as knowledge was lost, still governed by a nobility that saw muggles as not quite human. It was a terribly sad feeling, but not one that held any hint of doubt. Aftermath. Blaise Zabini. Blaise strolled through the hallways with careful, self-imposed slowness, his heart beating wildly as he tried to calm down. Ahem, said a dry, whispering voice from a shadowy alcove as he passed. Blaise jumped, but he didn't scream. Slowly he turned. In that small, shadowy corner was a black cloak so wide and billowing that it was impossible to determine whether the figure beneath was male or female, and atop the cloak a broad-brimmed black hat, and a black mist seemed to gather beneath it and obscure the face of whoever or whatever might lie beneath. Report, whispered Mr. Hat and Cloak. I said just what you told me to, said Blaise. His voice was a little calmer now that he wasn't lying to anyone. And Professor Quirrell reacted just the way you expected. The broad black hat tilted and straightened, as though the head below had nodded. "Excellent," said the unidentifiable whisper. "The reward I promised you is already on its way to your mother, by owl." Blaise hesitated, but his curiosity was eating him alive. "Can I ask now why you want to cause trouble between Professor Quirrell and Dumbledore?" The headmaster hadn't had anything to do with the Gryffindor bullies that Blaise knew about, and besides helping Kimberly, the headmaster had also offered to make Professor Binns give him excellent marks in History of Magic even if he turned in blank parchments for his homework, though he'd still have to attend class and pretend to hand them in. Actually, Blaise would have betrayed all three generals for free, and never mind his cousin either, but he'd seen no need to say that. The broad black hat cocked to one side, as if to convey a quizzical stare. "Tell me, friend, Blaise, did it occur to you that traitors who betray so many times over often meet with ill ends?" "Nope," said Blaise, looking straight into the black mist under the hat. "Everyone knows that nothing really bad ever happens to students in Hogwarts." Mr. Hat and Cloak gave a whispery chuckle. "Indeed," said the whisper. "With the murder of one student 5 decades ago being the exception that proves the rule, since Salazar Slytherin would have keyed his monster into the ancient wards at a higher level than the headmaster himself." Blaise stared at the black mist, now beginning to feel a little uneasy. But it ought to take a Hogwarts professor to do anything significant to him without setting off alarms. Quirrell and Snape were the only professors who'd do something like this, and Quirrell wouldn't care about fooling himself, and Snape wouldn't hurt one of his own Slytherins, would he? "No, friend Blaise," whispered the black mist. "I only wish to advise you never to try anything like this in your adult life. So many betrayals would certainly lead to at least one vengeance." "My mother never got any vengeances," said Blaise proudly. "Even though she married 7 husbands, and every single one of them died mysteriously and left her lots of money." "Really?" said the whisper. "However did she persuade the 7th to marry her after he heard what happened to the first 6? "I asked Mum that," said Blaise, "and she said I couldn't know until I was old enough, and I asked her how old was old enough, and she said, older than her." Again the whispery chuckle. "Well then, friend Blaise, my congratulations on having followed in your mother's footsteps. Go, and if you say nothing of this, we will not meet again." Blaise backed uneasily away, feeling an odd reluctance to turn his back. The hat tilted. "Oh, come now, little Slytherin. If you were truly the equal of Harry Potter or Draco Malfoy, you would have already realized that my hinted threats were just to ensure your silence before Albus. Had I intended to harm, I would not have hinted. Had I said nothing, then you should have worried." Blaise straightened, feeling a little insulted, and nodded to Mr. Hat and Cloak, then turned decisively and strode off toward his meeting with the headmaster. He'd been hoping to the very end that someone else would show up and give him a chance to sell out Mr. Hat and Cloak. But then Mum hadn't betrayed 7 different husbands at the same time. When you looked at it that way, he was still doing better than her. And Blaise Zabini went on walking toward the headmaster's office, smiling, content to be a quintuple agent. For a moment the boy stumbled, but then straightened, shaking off the odd feeling of disorientation. And Blaise Zabini went on walking toward the headmaster's office, smiling, content to be a quadruple agent. Aftermath. Hermione Granger. The messenger didn't approach her until she was alone. Hermione was just leaving the girls' bathroom where she sometimes had to think, and a bright shining cat leaped out of nowhere and said, "Miss Granger?" She let out a little shriek before she realized the cat had spoken in Professor McGonagall's voice. Even so, she hadn't been frightened, only startled. The cat was bright and brilliant and beautiful, glowing with a white-silver radiance like moon-colored sunlight, and she couldn't imagine being scared. "What are you?" said Hermione. "This is a message from Professor McGonagall," said the cat, still in the professor's voice. "Can you come to my office and not speak of this to anyone?" "I'll be there right away," said Hermione, still surprised, and the cat leaped and vanished. Only it didn't vanish. It traveled away somehow. Or that was what her mind said, even though her eyes just saw it disappear. By the time Hermione had got to the office of her favorite professor, her mind was all a-whirl with speculations. Was there something wrong with her transfiguration scores? But then why would Professor McGonagall say not to tell anyone? It was probably about Harry practicing his partial transfiguration. Professor McGonagall's face looked worried, not stern, as Hermione seated herself in front of the desk, trying to keep her eyes from going to the nest of cubbyholes containing Professor McGonagall's homework. She'd always wondered what sort of work grown-ups had to do to keep the school running, and whether they could use any help from her. "Miss Granger," said Professor McGonagall, "let me start by saying that I already know about the headmaster asking you to make that wish dash." "He told you," blurted Hermione in startlement. The headmaster had said no one else was supposed to know. Professor McGonagall paused, looked at Hermione, and gave a sad little chuckle. "It's good to see Mr. Potter hasn't corrupted you too much. Miss Granger, you aren't supposed to admit anything just because I say I know. As it happens, the headmaster did not tell me. I simply know him too well." Hermione was blushing furiously now. "It's fine, Miss Granger," said Professor McGonagall hastily. "You're a Ravenclaw in your first year. Nobody expects you to be a Slytherin." That really stung. "Fine," said Hermione with some acerbity. "I'll go ask Harry Potter for Slytherin lessons then." "That wasn't what I wanted to," said Professor McGonagall, and her voice trailed off. "Miss Granger, I'm worried about this because young Ravenclaw girls shouldn't have to be Slytherins. If the headmaster asks you to get involved in something you're not comfortable with, Miss Granger, it really is all right to say no. And if you're feeling pressured, please tell the headmaster that you would like me to be there, or that you would like to ask me first." Hermione's eyes were very wide. "Does the headmaster do things that are wrong?" Professor McGonagall looked a little sad at that. "Not on purpose, Miss Granger, but I think, well, it probably is true that sometimes the headmaster has trouble remembering what it's like to be a child. Even when he was a child, I'm sure he must have been brilliant and strong of mind and heart, with courage enough for 3 Gryffindors. Sometimes the headmaster asks too much of his young students, Miss Granger, or isn't careful enough not to hurt them. He is a good man, but sometimes his plotting can go too far. But it's good for students to be strong and have courage," said Hermione. "That's why you suggested Gryffindor for me, wasn't it?" Professor McGonagall smiled wryly. "Perhaps I was only being selfish, wanting you for my own house. Did the Sorting Hat offer you? No, I should not have asked. It told me I might go anywhere but Slytherin," said Hermione. She'd almost asked why she wasn't good enough for Slytherin before she'd managed to stop herself. "So, I have courage, Professor." Professor McGonagall leaned forward over her desk. The worry was showing plainer on her face now. "Miss Granger, it's not about courage. It's about what's healthy for young girls. The headmaster is drawing you into his plots. Harry Potter is giving you his secrets to keep. And now you're making alliances with Draco Malfoy. And I promised your mother that you would be safe at Hogwarts." Hermione just didn't know what to say to that. But the thought was occurring to her that Professor McGonagall might not have been warning her if she'd been a boy in Gryffindor instead of a girl in Ravenclaw. And that was, well, "I'll try to be good," she said, "and I won't let anyone tell me otherwise." Professor McGonagall pressed her hands over her eyes. When she took them away, her lined face looked very old. "Yes," she said in a whisper, "you would have done well in my house. Stay safe, Miss Granger, and be careful. And if you are ever worried or uncomfortable about anything, please come to me at once. I won't keep you any longer." Aftermath, Draco Malfoy. Neither of them really wanted to do anything complicated that Saturday, not after fighting a battle earlier. So Draco was just sitting in an unused classroom and trying to read a book called Thinking Physics. It was one of the most fascinating things that Draco had ever read in his life, at least the parts he could understand, at least when the accursed idiot who refused to let his books out of his sight could manage to shut up and let Draco concentrate. Hermione Granger is a mudblood, sang Harry Potter from where he sat at a nearby desk, reading a far more advanced book of his own. "I know what you're trying to do," said Draco calmly, without looking up from the pages. "It's not going to work. We're still ganging up and crushing you. A Malfoy is working with a mudblood. What will all your father's friends think, Dash? They'll think Malfoys aren't as easily manipulated as you seem to believe. Potters?" The defense professor was crazier than Dumbledore. No future savior of the world could ever be this childish and undignified at any age. "Hey, Draco, you know what's really going to suck? You know that Hermione Granger has 2 copies of the magical allele, just like you and just like me, but all your classmates in Slytherin don't know that, and you're not allowed to explain dash. Draco's fingers were whitening where they gripped the book. Being beaten and spat upon couldn't possibly require this much self-control, and if he didn't get back at Harry soon, he was going to do something incriminating. "So, what did you wish the first time?" said Draco. Harry didn't say anything, so Draco looked up from his book and felt a twinge of malicious satisfaction at the sad look on Harry's face. Harry said, "A lot of people ask me that, but I don't think Professor Quirrell would have wanted me to talk about it." Draco put a serious look on his own face. "You can talk about it with me. It's probably not important compared to the other secrets you've told me. And what else are friends for?" "That's right, I'm your friend." "Feel guilty." "It wasn't really all that interesting," Harry said with obviously artificial lightness. I wish Professor Quirrell would teach battle magic again next year." Harry sighed and looked back down at his book, and said, after another few seconds, "Your father's probably going to be pretty upset with you this Christmas, but if you promise him that you'll betray the Mudblood girl and wipe out her army, everything will go back to being all right, and you'll still get your Christmas presents." Maybe if he and Granger asked Professor Quirrell extra politely and used some of their Quirrell points, the 2 of them would be allowed to do something more interesting to General Chaos than putting him to sleep. Thank you for joining us for Part 7, Chapters 31 to 35 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. This section continues to challenge our perceptions, blending magic with science in ways that are both thrilling and thought-provoking. Did you know? The story has inspired countless discussions in philosophy and science communities, bridging the gap between fiction and real-world intellectual debates. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Grimoire Audiobooks. Share your thoughts on Harry's unique approach to the wizarding world and which moment resonated most with you. As we prepare for the next chapters, let Harry's relentless pursuit of understanding inspire your own quest for knowledge. Until next time, stay curious, stay magical, and thank you for being part of this journey. See you soon.